Uh, what your sense, Elizabeth?
Yeah, we can say a few words to get things started. Why not?
Okay. Yeah, please go.
Okay, well, yeah, I really enjoyed this panel. It gave me a lot to think about. And I also, like yesterday, thought the presentations they're interesting, engaging in some of the same conversations. I think one of the things that I was reflecting on, especially with like Andre's presentation and mine, in terms of the orientations. I mean, it is, um, it that even we're coming from quite different perspectives, but I so I guess I would just say two things. I think there is this interesting question around like regionalization, and especially because even in the way that in sort of the mainstream discussions of internationalization, um, and the way that knowledge is organized in the academy, there is this tension that we see that other scholars are sort of engaging with, which is area studies as this, obviously um, Cold War invention that some scholars have written about, sort of the organization of area studies and its linkages to, government and whatnot. But there is this decades long tradition of what it means to know a particular region and place with like a deep historical knowledge and language and whatnot. And then this shift that we now see towards the global being the key word, right? Like, in fact, many places now switch from internationalization to global engagement and whatnot. And so this idea of like the global in the abstract and the global as its own concept, and like what does global even mean, is other, I mean, obviously it invites other metaphors, but it implies sort of not the same as this deep regional knowledge. And so even at U of T, even we're having these like big discussions that are trying to bridge the international and then our like expertise in area studies to try and think up through what that means for the academy. And so then being on this panel where we're thinking about it from our like more critical perspectives, it's given me a lot to think about, because as as I mentioned, as an American citizen and, a white American citizen, like I have learned so much. I mean, tremendous. I like many of my values, my assumptions have been, I have been forced to reconcile, with what I actually believe, what I think about the world, what I take so for granted, what my own assumptions are, by my like living and sort of deep connections with the people in the Middle East region as a whole, and just in particular places and conversations that I've had. And so I understand that discourse where we sort of promote this idea around like global citizenship, that like study abroad is a transformative experience that we hear that's so mainstream. It's often, though, it can't, for me at least, it has been a source of really of thinking differently. I really have encountered and had many, many interesting conversations with people who just, they, have like really have very different values or worldviews or assumptions. And so in some ways I see that the value in that sort of like deep regional knowledge. And yet, even if I sort of really don't like the discourse of like study abroad is transformative. And so I do see these as like really an interesting conversation, I would just say, like, as in one sense, like regional perspectives and as this chance for humility in many ways, but then also the way that like especially my position really does reproduce these very like orientalist um, patterns and colonial patterns. And then from Andre's presentation, I just say I found his use of the word excavating really interesting. And because I don't know, it triggered a lot for me because of the way that like excavation is so linked to archaeology and anthropology and the problems of those disciplines in both the Middle East and North Africa and Africa. And so I really found that word really interesting when you talk about like excavating African knowledge and how that in some ways is like repositioning this Orientalist and like approach or field. And so anyways, you didn't talk much about it, but it really it resonated with me a lot. And so that's just my one thought for you. And I'm really interested in, yeah, these relationships between Africanization, regionalization, internationalization, and also then this idea of the global. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I must say this. This got me going, and of course, Sharon, thanks for those great questions. Uh, that steers some of the knocking together some of the thoughts here. But we have a couple of challenges, of course, as you would know, is that some people argue that that Africa is the most internationalized. If you look at the number of people with foreign degrees and number of in this space and so on, and of course the number of people going to study somewhere else and coming back. But of course, it is the most internationalized because it has a variety of knowledge systems embedded within its higher education system that doesn't belong to it, in a form of saying that. Now, even some of the knowledge formations that we have tried to put in place, like African studies, has turned, of course, into the kind of mirror image of the colonial modern project. And that's why you have massive calls on Africanizing African studies, since 2015 onwards as well. And so that's, and of course, I've also smiled when I saw some of, and that's massive projects. And some of that work and the analysis of what African studies centers are doing across the world, and of course, a big chunk of them are actually headed up by white academics from the north. Um, and even within that space, the project of excavation can't happen because it's a laying over onto a template of the colonial modern imagining of what knowledge formations then should look like, okay? And in many instances, of course, it becomes real area studies which literally writes out black altogether in that same space, And the same has happened with intersectionality in feminist studies as well. As you would know, the debate around the vanishing or the effervescence of race within intersectional studies. And in South Africa, of course, you have many intellectual movements that tries to reclaim an African feminism that has, more or less in the broader scheme of Africana studies, try to formulate a anti-colonial or decolonial project within those knowledge formations. But its appropriation into different spaces, it's almost a given the way in which the university is structured within our spaces and the sets of unequal arrangements that makes up the relationship with the North in a variety of ways, of course. And so there for me, there's almost like I'm at the point of exploring that knowledge a priori actually belongs to racism already, that at its very moment of disciplining, it has racism has a proprietary relationship over knowledge. You see, and part of the reason why that of course, I still have to do a lot of work on this, but I've written 2 pieces in that space, is that if you have African studies that become non-African and white over a period of 2 decades, there must be an explanatory, an interpretive scheme behind it that makes those processes happens. That even as you produce black knowledge, it lands within a Eurocentric white interpretive scheme. So I'm just trying to figure out whether the act of disciplining within itself doesn't inscribe already a racist logic into it. Doesn't matter what kind of knowledges you then put on the table. So I haven't, I must still do a bit of work and thinking and reading about that, but it's the same for me when it comes to African feminist studies as well. So that's part of the ways in which I try to think about it. You would know that in South Africa now and on our continent in general, we have an emerging debate between decolonization and Africanization. There are some scholars that think that the decolonial theory is another form of colonialism when it comes to the continent of Africa, of course, and trying to work according to African intellectual traditions themselves. Uh, I would, of course, like to put a seminar together on that, just to get the discussions going, because you can see it coming through in the different sets of conferences and seminars. But there is not yet an open conversation about it. That's the one. The second one is that there is a feeling that the decolonial theory and decolonial speak has become like a fad in higher education on the continent. Some of the young people, of course, literally blames the university systems for assimilating these various sets of concepts, and of course, not changing at all. And we're going to have a struggle with changing the knowledge project. In my presentation, of course, I've gotten some of these figures sorted out just to give you an idea of how this look like in our space and what kinds of debates we have at the present moment. But Elizabeth, I found your framing of the key discourses that drives the project, if one can call it like that, of internationalization in the Middle East, fascinating. So thanks so much for that. Of course, you will also know that on our continent we have different kinds of systems. So we also have a particular kind of discourse that ties in development and quality into a hierarchy that is already distributed according to socioeconomic class and race and other kinds of fault lines. So our Black universities, of course, as you would know, suffer that particular kind of hierarchization. And so you have an unequal distribution of worth of universities across the system that literally re-inscribe the existing inequalities within our higher education system. Despite some, so I took a huge education out of that particular kind of project, and the same within our context. The way in which a good internationalization project is seen as part of the global status of higher education, and of course as a country's higher education institution, and also we have massive bilaterals with other countries as well. So that particular kind of the depoliticization of those kinds of processes, and the idea that you may or you can have neutral internationalization processes, of course, as you would know, just feed back into the same kinds of problems as well. So I must say I am intrigued by the first challenge that Sharon put on the table around how we may how our own critiques of internationalization may circularly reproduce the same colonial logics that we are seeking to interrupt, and that of course would be a different way of looking at this project. My intuitive response would be from our side on the continent would be a firmer focus on the project of Africanization, I think, and not a nativist project, like trying to excavate an old project that was innocent somewhere within the, but a kind of progressive forward-looking project around Africanization, especially of our knowledge systems and ways of being. So I hope to further that work, especially against the backdrop of how African studies itself became complicit in the reproduction of Western higher education system on the continent. And so I would certainly would like to spend more energy on the Africanization project as I move ahead. Thanks for that. Sorry.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I emailed Clarissa and I haven't heard back, so I hope she's okay. But we will continue. And if anyone wants to speak to her presentation as well, I think we can do that. So maybe we can just start one first round of responses and questions about the presentations and the topic of the session. Does anyone feel inspired to start?
Okay, I'll start. So thanks, Sharon, for putting together the session on regionalisms. I think it was really important to have a session on regionalisms and to start to think of internationalization from a few different places. Because I think that it's just assumed that, you know, internationalization starts somewhere on one side of the Atlantic or the other side of the Atlantic, and it doesn't really start anywhere else. And, you know, everywhere it has to look out from that one vantage point, and that really has a lot of limitations, you know, quite, I mean, just factually, because it doesn't really reflect where the majority of the world is. So I think that was something that was really interesting, to have those contributions from Andre and from sorry, I've forgotten your name.
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Sorry, I did watch it, like the whole thing. And Clarissa, just to have a sense of different regions struggling with this kind of non-real universalism of internationalization, right? That looks really different in different places. So in relation to Elizabeth, I could see that what your little lecture gave, I suppose, was the sense of being in the middle of working on lots of different problems of being located, yeah, and thinking about a region that's not that is in itself, the Middle East is itself constructed in a kind of imperialistic or neo-imperialistic way. Like, you know, why focus on these particular countries and not the others? Why focus on just the Islamic or the Arab countries, and you know, and that part of North Africa, but not other parts, and not other parts of the Near or not that far east. So that kind of raised a lot of questions for me that I don't really have a particular steer on, but I think it brings us also a bit closer towards the next lot of papers which are on racism and the theme of addressing racism, when we don't really know what we are talking about exactly. And it's really important to know what we're talking about when we talk about racism, but we don't know what that is exactly. So that's something I took from your talk and listening to your talk and thinking about that. And how does it relate to, you know, anti-Arabism? How does it relate to Orientalism? How does it relate to American imperial hegemony and war? And, you know, so there's so many different things to think about there. With Andres, I really, really appreciate the opportunity to think about Africanity and this idea of Africa as a place. And that whole question of decoloniality versus Pan-Africanism, or some kind of an Afrocentric perspective, right? And I just kind of thought of this book, this old book. It's really a collection of essays. Let me just paste it in the chat. Yeah, there we are. About post-colonial, it's Benita Parry's. It's really not really a book. It's a collection of essays, which are quite detailed. It's quite an old book and quite old essays. She just passed away a few months ago. Anyway, yeah, she has one essay in there, which is titled something like "Two Cheers for Nativism." So I thought of that essay when I was watching your presentation and thinking about the whole Tefera David debate. And this question of whether one gives 3 cheers for African knowledge, higher education system, or yeah, whether it's 2 or 3 cheers. Anyway, so that was it's a bit long-winded thing that I'm thinking about there. And yeah, anyway, I've talked enough. Somebody come after me.
Mm-hmm.
Does someone want to go?
Well, I just have a comment. If that's, I wanted to just to really briefly speak back to the point that Andre was making. I also have thought a lot about knowledge production in writing my book. I didn't talk about it very much in my internationalization talk, but we see the same trends in the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, like, I mean, I, in my book, have some quotes published from like the World Bank that literally 2013 used something like citations per capita as the way they're like proxying the region's contribution to world knowledge or something. It's like very offensive. And they say the Middle East and North Africa is failing on this because there's no production in Arabic. And like Arabic is the dominant language, you know, the official languages, and then the like mother tongue of most people in the region. And so it is, and so actually there are some initiatives to try and sort of reclaim Arabic as a scholarly language that are going on in the region. And there's one, I went and visited one that's called the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. And it's a very unique institution because they are using Arabic, which is not used in most of the higher education institutions, especially in the sciences. They're teaching in French or English. And so that's obviously reproducing, you know, these colonial dynamics, but also in the name of like science. And so to try and actually teach the sciences and then social sciences in Arabic is this new project. Is very recent, and it's very interesting to think about the ways in which like it's being state sponsored and it's being encouraged. They built a beautiful new campus, and yet it's a really complicated dynamic because they're recruiting faculty who are trained in many cases in North America or Europe and want the academic trajectory. And so when I spoke with them, they're like, we're trying to publish in Arabic, but at the same time, like those publications are not going to be cited. They're not going to get the impact that we want. And so we actually have these like dual faces where we need to be, in order to have the trajectory we want, we actually have to also be publishing in English. And so it's actually this, I mean, it's a fascinating, I go into the like this case because I definitely think that the role of language is one way in which we are definitely reproducing colonial dynamics by like this, you know, just this assumption that English is sort of the dominant and natural language. It's obviously the one that, you know, I'm most comfortable in. I benefit a lot from that. And so that is, but it's one that I think a lot about, like how would my scholarship look if I had to write and speak only in Arabic? You know, it would be harder. And so I definitely think a lot about the sort of the not, and so there are some really great Arab scholars who write about the differences that in which like who receives their work and how broad they are received and what their impact is when they write sort of essentially on the same topics in English versus Arabic. And so I think a lot about that and the role of like language in knowledge production and how it's being used to continually portray the region as failing. But, and so actually, and it is really closely tied to internationalization processes because, for example, like Qatar is a really interesting example that brings in a faculty to co-publish. And so you have international academic mobility, and there that is happening in their like short-term faculty that are co-authoring and yet they're being used to like get more publications for Qatar. And so it's a controversial project. And so it's actually really interesting the way these topics are so intertwined.
Good. On the question of publications, Elizabeth, we have the same, I think it's 0.1% in terms of the contributions to the global knowledge sector. That's the figure that's been, for our continent at least. Of course, that is if you believe that those measurements are legitimate in various kinds of ways. And I think that is precisely the problem, and we are forced, you can of course have conscientious objections to not being rated as a scholar in South Africa, but it can only last for so long, because you get then streamed into different kinds of ways. I at least have survived up till now, but with each and every annual round, there's more pressure being put on you. And of course, the withdrawal of research funding comes with that, because you don't want to subject yourself to these kinds of processes. It's a very difficult issue that one has to face within the way in which the system is working. So I suspect that we're going to have huge challenges. There are some universities now on our continent that offer postgraduate degrees, masters, and PhDs in vernaculars and indigenous languages. In South Africa, there's a few universities, and some of those studies are growing actually. Then there are also some scholars who for some of these indigenous language concepts that have huge comparisons to modern philosophical constructions and all those kinds of things that seems to develop into a strand of work all by themselves. So there are possibilities there as well, and very exciting possibilities, of course. But the big question, of course, is whether from the side of Sue, the interest in understanding Africanity, of course, should be a global interest, because I don't think that the question of global racism is going to be engaged with without a full engagement with our continent. That is for sure. And part of the reason why we are moving into these various kinds of cycles that we are seeing now is precisely of the various kinds of discourses that are attached to whole continents that people sometimes refer to as one country as well. And of course, that is a historically produced discourse that needs to be tackled, at such a deep level that I think that we will probably have to do various forms of disciplinary excavations to see where these roots of these discourses are, so that at those micro levels one can see how we can work against those projects. So it's actually a global project. Of course, there are some writings too on internationalization on the continent as Pan-Africanism. I've scanned them. I think they're just using words actually. I was very excited when I saw some work on Pan-Africanism or internationalization on the continent as Pan-Africanism. But what they merely refer to is a diverse group of students that comes together in a mathematics project, from different countries. And then they call that Pan-Africanism. Of course, that Pan-Africanism is a kind of a worldview and philosophy that's much more than that, than the exchange of students as well. So that project would be a fascinating project as well. Of course, there will be a huge debate whether one use nativism as a way of engaging that project. There are some people who think that native new forms of essentialisms, and that we have to be careful as to what point of departure we engage, what point of departure we choose for starting that particular debate.
Kumar, you want to go?
Yeah, I wanted to thank both Elizabeth and Andre. I learned a lot about, yeah, the intricacies and complexities that regionalization brings. I mean, there was a recent article by, I think, Jane Knight in CIE on regionalization in the Arab states, and part of that led me to also I'm sort of, I guess this sort of betrays my bias a little bit, but this whole business of quality assurance, and to me it sort of brings in the whole managerialism creep, but also utter neocolonialism in running around, is trying to establish sort of quality assurance. And in particular, I think that was one of the ways in which this whole regionalization thing was stimulated, and it's also taken up only in terms of quality assurance. And I wondered about your views on that, which I think is actually really harmful for the greatest sort of the generative possibilities of regionalization.
Kumari, are you talking to Elizabeth or to myself? I didn't get
To
it.
both of you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I can speak to that definitely. Yeah. Also, yes, I saw that piece. Haifa Jafar is one of our students here at OIZ, and so I saw, and yeah, she's one of my students, and she's got a great. She actually has a great. Her dissertation is exploring internationalization in post sort of war Iraq, and it's fascinating. And so, so I write. I have a whole book chapter on quality assurance, and it in the Arab world, and yeah, it's deeply problematic. As it's sort of, I did tie that into the talk about how it's you just perpetually being used to portray the whole region's institutions as like failing, and they, as we use the same metrics that we're familiar with that are like deeply problematic around rankings and just blanket statements. There's no Arab university in the top 500, etc. Like these, we know the rankings are just reproducing sort of resource inequalities and long-standing, language, etc. hierarchies. And so then what I sort of look at, then you see the emergence of all of these quality assurance agencies as this model that is happening throughout the region. And I mean, many of them are like copying some very like the UK models and some others, but they are, and it's, I mean, it's like being pushed, it's and funded by the World Bank. It's being tied into, in some cases, like other development work, but they're definitely, it's like essentially they're supposed to be like purely autonomous, independent bodies when in reality that it doesn't happen in the region. And so it's, I do think that the links between sort of internationalization and quality and rankings and these schema are very close in the Arab and Middle East, and in ways that like not in the same ways. At least the discourses are quite different, and so I do think it's very much entangled, and they're both. That's I sort of talk about that there is institutional initiative, but they're also being like embraced as like state projects in some ways, as it's like then a state goal to improve the quality, and that is and so it's sort of a complicated it's a complicated position for me to think about. Like, to Sue's original point is that I think that, I mean, one of the points that I make on quality assurance is it's a lot of it, it seems like very superficial, bureaucratic. You create a new agency, but it's not engaging with academics and whatnot. And so they're not really having the change, because this change, the reasons for the like high class sizes and whatnot are much more structural than just the creation of a new agency. But at the same time, like, I understand the desire of the state to like the government is pushing back against these narratives that they're failing, and especially there's like shame associated with that, in the Arab world, which is like shame is a cultural construct that is very powerful in many parts of the region. And so you understand and yet at the same time, the government is then taking a lot more power away from academics, for example. And so it's just a very problematic relationship. I'll stop there.
Yeah, we have a sub-regional system actually that's steered by our council on higher education, as a quality council for one of our subsystems in the post-school sector. Yeah, and I agree with Elizabeth. I think those are extension and proxy ideas for bigger political projects at play in a variety of ways. And so ours is probably three-layered. The one would be national, sub-regional, and then of course on the broader continent as a region. On the national scope, of course, the two concepts that are steering the entire imagination around this is excellence and quality. And that is not only to create a hierarchy of different subsystems within our university system amongst the 26 universities, because then you separate both white and black students and white and black families outside, right down those lines and right down those hierarchies, but of course on a class basis as well, So your entire quality assurance system actually re-inscribe differentiated worth to universities and of course to blocks of students. And of course at the lower end of that spectrum, you will find your black students and you will find your black universities. And of course the value of their degrees and the value of their studies in the broader consciousness of the country is then attached to that worth that has been generated by the quality assurance system. And actually very arbitrarily so, because the kinds of work that come out of our black universities, or predominantly black universities, fascinating work that never sees the light, even if you use the matrices of quality at play within the dominant sphere, even if we don't agree to that, but even if you use that, you can certainly get that. So there's a political project that's tightly linked into how the discourse of quality assurance plays itself out. And then, of course, Africa and its dominant role in the SADC region as well, almost been accused of a kind of a colonizing power in that space around higher education systems as well. So we will also have to be careful about how we as a country present ourselves into that space. So quality assurance as a subfield of the higher education system certainly requires a critical eye as to how it circulate and mobilize the key concepts that actually generate various forms of inequalities around historically produced lines actually globally within the system as well. So one has to be very careful when one mobilizes that kind of work. So your question in the chat room, yes, of course, we are forced to publish in high impact journals. That's for sure. But at least and in English, of course. But at least we can produce masters and PhDs in vernacular languages or in indigenous languages. And then we have a few journals, of course, with also African languages within which you can publish as well. CODESRA, our social science association on the continent, has tried a lot to bring some of these to the fore. But like everybody else, we are streamed, in a global system around the question of publications, unfortunately so.
So there's this problem of streaming.
Sorry, is it okay?
Oh,
Just because Tatiana was going to talk right before Andre. Is it okay?
I was just a reaction, so let me try to recollect what I wanted to say. I was intrigued by Suming's comment in the chat that quality assurance is also about the rise of marketing as the predominant activity rather than educational research. And this is a really great point that made me think of Gerardo's actual work on quality assurance as well, his research on this. And that quality assurance spread regionally, of course, leads to isomorphic changes. Institutions willingly adopt new practices, new policies and structures that are recommended by the World Bank or OECD or the Bologna process. And what they do with it, however, is not just copying. There's evidence of allomorphism in a way, in other words, the shape is reproduced, but the meaning is filled in with local practices, local traditions, local value sets. And as an example, the idea of shared governance traveled. This is an example of a post-Soviet Russian universities that try to stay very competitive and publish in English. Leading universities adopted consciously the idea of shared governance. So they rearranged the existing governance structures to create the faculty senates. However, the way it was understood is not that the governance is shared, rather it is separated. So shared governance is in a way like, you know, you have a shared room, you have a division that strictly delineates the responsibilities of faculty and the powers of administrators. So in many ways, it was used to reinforce the existing power structures, rather totalitarian kind of, some would argue. And so we see this, however, this practice allows Russian universities, for example, to claim that they have world standards, meaning standards dictated by the European Union and the Western world, yet they have the local meanings and traditions. At the same time, there's evidence that a lot of these adoption of Western quality standards or practices are also used for political reasons to legitimize local political elites who are initiating these programs. And it's most visible in the post-Soviet space in the cases of Central Asia. Small Central Asian nations, their presidents, they're known to have autocratic political systems, but with the rule of technocrat elites who were educated in the US, these reforms are used as a proof of progress and moving the nations closer towards the West, towards modernization. In this case, modernization is the language of and the discourse of modernization is explicitly used to signal progress. So you can argue and see how Central Asians are pulling themselves, visually, to become part of Western white European space. And this is true, but what is also true is that the local context serves to reinforce local tradition, and they're filled with local meanings that are used for the political purposes of legitimizing political reforms. That was my comment. So this is a long way to say that, yes, universities under the quality assurance regimes, they are engaged in marketization, which is an economic move, but at the same time, they're part of a larger political project of the national elites.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say the exact same thing is happening in the Arab world, where they're bringing in those models, they're doing the same, and then it's to legitimize, and in many ways, like those governance structures look similar, but they're still there's still like ultimate authority. It still rests with usually like the king or to actually appoint presidents and stuff, despite these new governance systems. And it's happening.
I'm wondering if Sarah, I was going to say, Sarah would speak to this Central Asian thing. And then maybe also, I was wondering if Gerardo wanted to say something too later about the quality assurance, but no pressure. But Sarah, well, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Just real quick. Just to follow up on the Central Asian point, which I completely agree with. And I think it just reminded me as well that it might be really useful to remember to historicize this idea of internationalization and the processes. And I think, you know, in the past few days, we've tended to talk about it either sort of now or in the broad sort of, you know, colonial sweep or as something neoliberal. And it just reminded me of how what you describe. I was working in Central Asia in the late 1990s and sort of mid 1990s, and what you describe how those processes were sort of enacted there before quality assurance came around as a kind of the way we think of it now as being so developed, and when it was embedded in US aid and democratization and open society movements and that kind of thing, and how, like, sort of looking at the deeper foundations that are sort of the middle range. It's not even that middle, it's recent, but just, you know, it just really reminded me of how fast things have changed, even though they've remained, you know, fundamentally the same. And sort of, you know, just thinking about how those things get embedded in different sorts of movements that are ideologically motivated. So yeah, I just thought it was a really interesting point.
Yeah. So if I could just add, this is going to come out really, like, it's very rough, right? I'm thinking through it, but I really think, you know, and I wanted to go back to one of the quotes that Andre, that you used in your presentation, so you're kind of referring to this idea, right, that kind of regionalization is like the other side of the internationalization, right, coin. And I think that's very true. I think there is another meaning to that, which is we often tend to think about regionalization as this response or resistance, right? And I'm very skeptical of that idea, right? Because I just tend to think of, we have very good examples of how that is not the case. Like, for example, the very notion of Latin America was invented by the French after the independence movements in the region so that they could legitimize recolonizing discourse, right? So that they could insert themselves again, right? So I'm very skeptical that that is the answer or the way to push back, right? And I really think, not being an expert in the region, but you know, ASEAN, so in, you know, in the Southeast Asia region, the discourse of quality assurance kind of like having this like shared credential space, but in a way it's reproducing the European template. Let's not even get started with North America. We have our very own like tensions and problems, right? But I really think, you know, so it could be a trap, right? And I think sometimes there are some very well-intentioned movements to say, well, this is going to be our alternative, right? Like, this is going to be our response. And I think as a critical group of scholars, right, we need to introduce this skepticism, right? Like, that is not the answer, right? Because it's just very easy for these discourses to get reabsorbed into the dominant discourse of homogenizing things. And that's really mostly what quality assurance does, right? Like, you either fall in line and become recognized as legitimate, or you don't, and then you pay serious consequences for that.
Does anyone who hasn't spoken have response or question? Stuart?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts and picking up on some of the conversation. When I listened to Andre's your presentation, one of the things that struck me was the comment about the tension between internationalization and Africanization. And of course, I knew what you meant, but at the same time, if Africanization is anything, surely it is a phenomenon of internationalization as well. And just kind of think about the categories we use to focus our attention and shape our critique, and what is it that we call internationalization, and what is it that we're not calling internationalization, and maybe it's kind of looking more broadly and kind of thinking about different projects of internationalization, so that Africanization might be that project, or there might be other kind of counter projects going on within, for example, within the Middle East, if there's American projects of setting up universities or so forth. there's also counter projects within those spaces, right? A gap between the intention and the outcome. So that was one kind of comment out there and thinking about the concept of internationalization. The other one is kind of the focus on the higher education sector. So that a lot of the discussion is about what's going on in the higher education sector and the kinds of universities we have in any given country or region. But also it seems really important to me to think about the higher education sector in relation to what's going on outside it. And what I mean, so if you think about the Middle East and North Africa over the last decade, there's this rising rhetoric of there's too many university graduates, right? I mean, kind of post-Arab Spring, the reason there's all these uprisings and so forth, there are all these, even with lower levels of enrollment in university, there's all these graduates, they don't have the jobs, there's underemployment, there's unemployment, that's causing problems. And so there's a push, it's an international discourse, right? I mean, it's very much, you have the British Council going into Morocco and saying there's too many university graduates, or the World Economic Forum going to Egypt saying there's too many university graduates, and a redirecting away. And of course, there's a kind of a longer standing discourse of development education, I think, in Africa about pushing countries away from investing in higher education. They're supposed to be invested in primary education, secondary education. And so if we don't pay attention to those kind of discourses, there's this danger, I think, that you can end up with your Africanized universities that are all nice, but they're no longer part of the game, right? The game's moved on, and it's all about corporate training or apprenticeship kind of regimes or so forth. So kind of always keeping a kind of a broader focus, I think, is important for us.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, perhaps because I have to get my mind around it, but my first response would be that that one should never confuse Africanization as opposed to internationalization. That's the first one. And that is going into a particular kind of cocoon that you can call an Africanized university. That's the other trap of that particular argument. Because in the affirmation of being African, which actually is one of the most accepted definition of Africanization, resides mostly into a knowledge project. Which of course doesn't displace any other forms and relationalities across the globe, but literally tries to cut off those that prescribe discourses of dysfunction onto the continent, okay? So the Africanization project is a project that wants to cut off discourses about dysfunction, about the continent, okay, in continental countries. So, but we'll formulate that in sophisticated ways so that there's not a nativist conception of Africanization that comes through as a particular form of a university that's envisaged that can be called Africanized. That's certainly not what's in my mind when I speak about the project of Africanization. Because the interrelations across various sets of world regions and within the continent is it's fairly obvious for the advancement of our systems, but of course on templates whose principles are designed within the African context. Of course, that's the big challenge for us. And part of those discourses around too many graduates and in the context of our universities and the linkages to society. I think what we certainly lack on the continent is a sense of of data mobilization that can argue from a scientific point of view as to what is required on the continent and what can be produced by universities. And that's actually also a wrong connection, because that creates an instrumentalist relationship that universities have to play. So one has to be careful in that space as well. But the Africa 2063 program certainly sets out those numbers as well. And in South Africa especially, and so you're right, we have this big discourse about unemployed graduates as well. And we have to think carefully about how this plays into a negative discourse around the university, because we require public legitimacy for universities to have a sense of national ownership with communities in that space. So thanks for bringing that point up. I will certainly bring it into play, and of course, also just sharpen some of the formulations about what is meant by Africanization in relation to concepts like internationalization. So many thanks.
I think I feel I haven't said anything, partly because there's so many experts about this in the room that I'm hesitant, and it has gone in a particular direction that I feel like I don't have much to say. But I guess in honor of also Clarissa's presentation too, and her kind of important, and I think actually all three of you did this, like, you know, okay, we'll be in the regionalism slot, but there's also a problem with this slot. And I think there's, especially when it comes to learning, like international, intercultural learning, there's a great deal of work to be done, especially on the part of the very arrogant North American, Canadian and US especially, and also European notion of learning about other people. So there's this very sort of objectified, consumption-based notion of those people and their knowledges that we really, like, despite all of our internationalization efforts, have not successfully interrupted for the most part. Then we've kind of like, okay, maybe we see, okay, learning about is a problem, but then we'll learn from. But then even this learning from has so many projections already, and so many frames on the receiving end that really block what can come in. And so then it just becomes like a romanticized version, or a selective hearing, or a grafting of those knowledges onto our own frames. So there's this approach is also flawed. So there's Gert Biesta has this distinction between learning from and being taught by, and I'm thinking about this notion of being taught by, and that would allow, this is a notion that you try to suspend your assumptions. You try to declutter the space to actually receive something and be surprised by it, and decenter yourself from the world. And I think, you know, this is a huge task that is not achieved with more information about the global other, or even the local other, whatever, because this happens with indigenous knowledges as well. So I think, and this is a deviance from this great conversation, but I also wanted to put it on the table as something that in critical internationalization studies, this question of like ethical intercultural learning that actually is transformative in the way that, Elizabeth, I think you were trying to gesture toward the possibility of, but we're so far from that, and wondering how we can move a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. I think that's so important. It's something I've thought a lot about. Yeah, even just the words that we have to talk, like, yeah, moving from learning from to being taught by. And it reminds me of something else that you've written about in the past, about like sometimes then you're confronted with knowledge and worldviews and ways of being that are just like fundamentally, you know, too irreconcilable, might be the words you use, and that it's a really interesting space to then navigate, you know, and I've definitely encountered that in my like experiences in the region of like, and I don't have any answers to that other than I do have much greater, at least like understanding and sympathy and empathy with perspectives that are like wholly different on things like polygamy and religion and many other areas that, but it's, and even democracy, you know, I like some of the things I mentioned. And so it's actually just a really interesting question. Mm-hmm.
Sarah, do you want to have a closing thought?
No, maybe not a closing one then.
Okay.
I can save it for another time.
No, go ahead. It's fine.
Okay. Just to say, to follow on from that as well, thinking about like the political economy and the material and relational conditions that we have for even being able to try to practice learning that kind of learning, which requires something totally different in my experience from what most things require when we are brought into encounter internationally with each other through the university. There's such roles of hierarchy, that there's roles of roles, there's huge baggage, there's huge trauma, you know, that comes into it, as well as expectations. And And a lot of the conditions, especially in terms of funding and things, are really shortly durational and quite asymmetrical in terms of funding and livelihood. And the kind of learning that you're talking about of being taught by is something that requires a fundamentally reorganized and rearranged material condition of relationality in terms of how we even encounter each other in the world. So I think it raises a really good question about where that happens and whether it happens in or outside of universities currently, whatever frame that looks like, and how there might be crossings between spaces to make that more possible.
Okay, so we are at our hour, and I want to make sure everyone has a break between now and our next session. Thank you all so much for bringing, this is really rich. I learned so much, actually. So thank you. I think we had somehow all the right people in the room for this conversation, which was great. So thank you especially to our presenters, Andre and Elizabeth. I'm not sure what happened to Clarice, so we'll find out hopefully. But I will see you all in an hour, I hope.
Bye, everyone.